we kind of know the way exposure works in digital. If I just take a shot here and apply the exposure effect to it in After Effects. And again, I'm doing a lot of this work here in After Effects, not specifically because After Effects is the place to do a lot of your color correction work, but all these tools work in all our kind of supported host platforms. And this is just a more fun place for me to kind of experiment with and show you guys some ideas here. So if I just take the exposure slider and begin to crank it up on this image, you can see both in the image and in the scope that as I expose, basically the values just kind of start slamming into the top of the range, and you can see this dense pile up here. And you've got this very harsh overexposure and these very ugly kind of colors. Her skin that was wonderfully nuanced here has now turned orange and yellow, and we've just peaked out at white. And this is kind of a typical look for a digital overexposure. And everything we know about film tells us that this is not how film behaves, right? So let's do a fun little experiment here, and let's actually model film negative here. So I've got this piece of footage from our test shoot here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just apply the invert effect to it. So I'm just going to make it into a negative just for fun. And maybe I'll also just make it black and white for the sake of simplicity. So I've got this idea of this negative, and what I'm going to do just to kind of model the idea of, instead of increasing exposure, the idea of increasing density on a film negative. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch the blend mode of this layer in After Effects to multiply, and then I'm just going to duplicate it. You can see that it makes the image darker, and since the image is negative, that's kind of emulating the notion of adding more density to the negative, which is adding more exposure. But watch the values in the scope here. Whereas before we saw them sliding just right off the top and trying to like leave through the ceiling. Watch what happens as I keep duplicating this layer. Watch how instead of sliding off the bottom, right, they're just piling up at the bottom. And this is kind of like my weird digital simulation of something that is kind of weirdly magical about film, is that as we would, hit this layer of celluloid with more and more light, those little chemicals in there are not just stopping their work. They will respond to more light and more light and more light. And you can shine a flashlight on them and they'll get really, really dark, but then you can shine the sun on them and they will, even though they're kind of maxed out by what the flashlight did to them, they will still find a little more density to record there. So film has this incredibly high dynamic range, but it also has this kind of gradual response to overexposure. So think of it as the difference between slamming your car into the brick wall and slamming your car into a giant foam pad. We were talking about it earlier. It's like a Tempur-Pedic mattress for light. It just, no matter how hard you hit it, it's going to respond a little bit. So we're trying to kind of digitally model that here using just the multiply blend mode, because as we multiply, we're not going to like slide past zero. We're going to pile up into increasingly close to zero, but never quite there. So then, of course, what we can do, let's delete those layers and kind of start fresh, but let's simulate the idea of putting a print stock on it. So we can put a little invert adjustment layer at the top of everything. So we've got our image back. And now let's model that overexposure again. And you can see that as I'm multiplying the layers, you can see that my blowing out that's happening on my digital film, and now we'll actually remove the black and whiteness of it and we can model it in color as well. You can see that like her skin stays skin color much longer and we don't get that peaking out to yellow. And we get this very, very gradual sense of overexposure. And even as I've duplicated this layer like dozens of times, you can still just barely make out some of the details on her there. But you do notice some problems like this yellow chip here. So it's not perfect. This is not a perfect model, but it does start to show you a little bit of that kind of ineffable quality of film. A lot of it has to do with how it responds to an excess of light, and then a lot of it has to do with how it responds to color as an excess of light is created.